May 1945. The air across Europe, once choked with the metallic shriek of combat, now hung thick with the dust of collapse and the profound silence of defeat. The Allied advance had broken the Reich, yet the immense logistical challenge of victory was just beginning. It was not merely a matter of occupying territory, but of processing the human debris of a fallen regime. This is a story about the complex, often contradictory final act of the war, a clash of cultures, strategies, and deeply ingrained perceptions, centered on a specific, almost unbelievable, historical irony. The scene is set in the newly established internment camps across the Allied-occupied zones, vast sprawling enclosures carved out of fields and abandoned factories. Inside, amongst the hundreds of thousands of disarmed German personnel, were women, not just nurses or support staff, but members of the Helferinnen, female auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht, anti-aircraft personnel, signals operators, and even combatants and guards from the various branches of the Nazi apparatus. They were designated as prisoners of war or disarmed enemy personnel, DEP, and their captors were often men from a land they barely knew, Canada. To the German women, many of whom had been isolated by wartime propaganda and a strict Spartan ideology of physical fitness and duty, the sight of the Allied soldiers was often a stark confrontation with a reality far different from what they had been taught. Their own officers and men, hardened by years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front or depleted by the attrition in the West, often appeared gaunt, worn, and psychologically frayed. The Canadian soldiers, however, presented a different tableau. This is where our historical irony begins, the overwhelming physical presence of the Canadians. Why did they seem so fundamentally different? The answer is not simple. Lying at the intersection of wartime logistics, nutrition science, and the industrial capacity of the North American continent, elements the Axis powers could never truly comprehend. The Helferinnen, like 20-year-old Anja Keller, a former signals operator captured near the Ruhr Pocket, found themselves staring, not with hostility, but with a profound, almost involuntary curiosity. Anja's diary entry, later recovered by intelligence units, speaks volumes. "They are immense," she wrote on May 12th, "not simply taller but broader. Their uniforms, clean, too clean, cannot hide a sheer bulk that our men, even the healthiest amongst the officers, simply do not possess. It is frightening, yet confusing. We were told of the decadent, starving enemy. The reality was that the Canadian Expeditionary Force, fed by an unprecedented supply chain stretching across the Atlantic, enjoyed a caloric intake and a balanced diet virtually unknown to the combat forces of the collapsing Reich. The average daily ration of a Canadian combat soldier was over 4,000 calories, rich in protein and varied nutrients, provided by the massive, untouched farmlands and industrial output of Canada and the United States. In contrast, the German soldiers' diet, particularly towards 1944-45, was severely rationed, often monotonous and deficient, leading to a visible physical wearing down. The Canadian soldiers, many of them having recently arrived from a non-depleted home front, maintained a muscularity and an overall physical vitality that was, in the context of ravaged Europe, truly shocking. This physical disparity became a silent, psychological weapon, a constant unspoken reminder of the war's strategic reality, the Allies' unmatched logistical strength. It was the material consequence of a war won not just by courage, but by the relentless output of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Toronto. This spectacle of physical strength and abundance, embodied in the very men guarding them, introduced a potent element of cognitive dissonance into the minds of the POWs. The propaganda was a lie, and the proof was standing right in front of them, looking impossibly robust, well-fed, and, in Anja's later recollection, radiating an undeniable aura of relaxed confidence. The suspense of our narrative will unfold through this contrast. We must ask, how did this unexpected physical reality influence the subsequent interrogations, the slow process of denazification, and the ultimate perception of the war's outcome? And what mysterious high-stakes game of intelligence was Anja Keller truly playing behind the veil of a bewildered captive? Her story, anchored by this visual shock, is the key to unlocking a hidden chapter of the war's end, a chapter where physical presence became a silent, strategic message. Before we delve deeper into Anja's background and the peculiar mission of the Canadian Provost Corps, I invite you to join us on this journey through the unwritten history of the Second World War. If you find this type of deep, strategic, and human-focused historical analysis compelling, please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. Your support ensures that these untold stories continue to be brought to light. The sheer scale of the logistical effort that created the broad-shouldered Canadian is a story of industrial might that needs telling. By 1944, the Canadian Army was running a supply line that was a marvel of military engineering and strategic management. While German U-boats had strained the sea lanes, the Allied convoy system, protected by advanced radar and overwhelming air superiority, had perfected the transatlantic pipeline. This wasn't just about bringing shells and tanks, it was about food, a highly specific, scientifically tailored diet designed to maintain peak combat effectiveness. The term logistical colossus is not hyperbole. The Allied Quartermaster Corps operated on a simple yet devastating principle. A well-fed soldier is a victorious soldier. Their field kitchens were provisioned with canned meats from Chicago, powdered milk from Wisconsin, and vast quantities of chocolate, coffee, and fresh fruits whenever feasible. The Allied M1944 combat ration, while not a feast, delivered consistent energy. A Canadian infantryman consumed nearly double the calories and significantly more varied proteins than his counterpart in the German Heer by the final year of the conflict. One Canadian engineer, Sergeant Major James "Mac" MacDonald, overseeing a depot near Antwerp in late 1944, recalled the scale with a touch of awe. "We were pushing through 20,000 tons of supplies a day, tanks, fuel, yes, but mostly food. The Germans were eating ersatz coffee and potato soup. We had steak and real coffee straight from the tin. It was grotesque, but that's what won the war. You can't fight for 6 months on an empty stomach and expect to look like an athlete." This systemic advantage was invisible on the maps of military strategists, yet it played out on the bodies of the fighting men. German nutrition, particularly after the devastating losses in the East and the systematic bombing of their synthetic fuel and industrial centers, had collapsed. The German concept of ersatz, substitute, extended to almost every facet of life and combat, including nutrition. Rye instead of wheat, thin soup instead of thick stew, and reliance on Pervitin, a methamphetamine, to stave off fatigue, masking the underlying physical depletion. The body itself became a casualty of the failed strategy. For Anja Keller and her fellow Helferinnen, this physical contrast was a profound moment of political disillusionment. They had been raised on images of the Übermensch, the ideologically and physically superior Aryan soldier. The reality of their captors shattered this core belief. The sheer, effortless health of the Canadians signaled not only superior rations, but a fundamental failure in the Nazi vision of total war. They had failed to secure the necessary resources, and their soldiers were paying the price with their very constitution. The psychological impact of this physical dominance cannot be overstated. In the early days of captivity, interrogators noted a strange, almost submissive deference from the German female POWs towards the Canadians. Dr. Wilhelm Kienzl, a captured German physician tasked with processing medical records at a DEP camp, wrote in his analysis, "The women stared, fixated on the breadth of the shoulders, the size of the hands, the sheer solid mass of the enemy." It was not admiration for the individual, but a silent acknowledgement of the superiority of the machine, the supply line that fed them. The propaganda of the fat American was reversed. They were strong, healthy, and therefore undeniably victorious. This physical asymmetry became a silent tactical advantage for the Allied intelligence services. It created a psychological vulnerability, a crack in the hardened ideological armor of the German personnel. It was a visible manifestation of abundance and power, generating a sense of awe and, critically, a willingness to comply that was often lacking when German prisoners were initially confronted by the French or Soviet forces, whose own troops were visibly fatigued by the fighting. This chapter sets the stage for the true mystery. Anja Keller was not just any Helferin. She carried information of critical strategic value, possibly related to the final, desperate Nazi resistance efforts. The Canadian Guards, with their aura of healthy confidence, were the first line of psychological attack. Could their silent physical presence make her talk, or was she using this very shock to disguise a deeper, more dangerous agenda? The answers lie in the specific camp where Anja was held and the unique, highly classified interrogation tactics being employed there. Anja Keller was not a combat soldier in the traditional sense, yet her story embodies the total mobilization of the German home front. Born in 1925 in Munich, she grew up steeped in the ideology of the Bund Deutscher Mädel, BDM, the League of German Girls. Her education was rigorously focused on duty, sacrifice, and the belief in the Reich's ultimate destiny. By 1943, as the tide of the war turned, the manpower crisis meant that women were pushed into increasingly critical roles. Anja was assigned to a Nachrichtenhelferin, Signals Auxiliary Unit, a vital nerve center of the Wehrmacht. She specialized in high-frequency radio operations and cryptology, working in underground bunkers near major industrial hubs, relaying encrypted communications and coordinating anti-aircraft defense. This was not the front line, but it was a position of immense strategic importance, giving her access to operational details and the unfiltered, often desperate communications of the collapsing regime. Her world, and the world of thousands like her, was defined by discipline and deprivation. The uniform was a badge of honor, the rationing a necessary sacrifice. The propaganda machine relentlessly reinforced the idea of a weak, materially obsessed enemy, while praising the German soldiers' superior spiritual and physical toughness. This conditioning made the eventual sight of the Canadians, with their easy, well-fed bearing, a cognitive explosion. The focus must now shift to the nature of her captivity. Anja was interned in Camp 030, a relatively small, ad hoc facility in the British zone of occupation, primarily guarded by the Canadian Provost Corps. This specific unit had a reputation for strict but generally fair treatment of POWs, a policy that contrasted sharply with the often brutal conditions faced by prisoners in the Soviet sector. This soft power approach was, in itself, a strategic tool. The interrogation method deployed at Camp 030 was subtle and psychological. It involved minimal physical duress, focusing instead on environmental and psychological pressure to induce cooperation. The deliberate display of Allied abundance, the food, the clean uniforms, and yes, the noticeable physical health of the guards was a key, often unspoken, element. Major Ian Campbell, a Canadian intelligence officer at Camp 030, noted in his end-of-war debriefing, "We didn't need to threaten them. We just needed them to look. Our logistics won the battle for us long before the interrogation started." When a young German woman who has subsisted on meager rations for years sees a 20-year-old corporal who looks like he's been training for the Olympics, she doesn't just see a guard, she sees the absolute failure of her entire system. The psychological barrier crumbles. Anja, however, was a difficult subject. She maintained the rigid discipline of her training, answering questions truthfully, but volunteering nothing of strategic value. She spoke of her work, the location of her bunker, and the general state of morale, but remained silent on the critical details of her unit's final, desperate orders. The interrogators were convinced she knew more about the potential for werewolf, Nazi stay-behind activity in her sector. Her captors observed her reactions closely. They noted her intense, almost involuntary gaze at the Canadian Guards during outdoor exercise. This was the outward manifestation of the internal conflict. Her ideological training demanded contempt for the decadent enemy, but her eyes registered the undeniable proof of their superior material reality. It was a secret, silent staring that betrayed the collapse of her indoctrination. The specific mystery surrounding Anja is twofold. First, the contents of the final communication she handled before her capture, which intelligence suspected was a key part of the planned, prolonged guerrilla resistance, and second, the peculiar artifact found hidden in her shoe heel, a tiny, intricately carved wooden bird, which seemed utterly out of place for a dedicated signals auxiliary. This bird, seemingly a sentimental trinket, will prove to be the linchpin of the entire operation, the real reason why Anja Keller was more than just another prisoner of war. The focus now shifts to the intricate world of intelligence and the secrets hidden in plain sight. The strategy of shock and awe of abundance employed by Allied intelligence was not an official policy, but a practical outcome of the vast industrial gap between the Allies and the Axis. It was a deliberate, if subtle, contrast designed to demoralize and disarm. This was the psychological warfare of the quartermaster. For the Canadian soldier, the perception was simply one of normal, well-managed operations. Private William "Billy" O'Connell, a 6'2" infantryman from Alberta, whose size was typical of his background on a wheat farm, was often the subject of this intense scrutiny at Camp 030. He was oblivious to his own strategic value. They used to line up near the fence, O'Connell recounted years later, not aggressive, just watching. Especially when we had our rations. We'd get tinned ham and peaches for dessert. They'd be eating their thin, watery soup. Their eyes, though, those eyes weren't looking at the peaches. They were looking at us, at the size of our arms, the way we carried our weight. It was like they were seeing a different species. They were taught we were weak, and we were the evidence of the opposite. This constant visual display of physical superiority broke down the key pillar of Nazi ideology, the belief in the moral and racial superiority of the German nation. The Canadian physique, a product of decades of peace, plentiful land, and high-protein diets, was a biological testament to the failure of the Reich's autarkic economy. This chapter delves into the scientific side of this disparity. Research conducted by Allied nutritionists during the war found a direct correlation between caloric intake, protein consumption, and not just physical size, but also mental resilience and reaction time. The superior Allied diet translated directly into a psychological edge. The German POWs were suffering not only from defeat, but from a form of chronic malnutrition that sapped their mental resistance and emotional fortitude. For the interrogators, this meant that the prisoners were often emotionally labile, prone to sudden shifts from rigid defiance to tearful collaboration. They were biologically primed to break. Anja Keller's initial defiance was a testament to her ideological rigor, yet even she was subject to the constant, grinding pressure of this environment. Major Campbell decided to exploit this physical shock by pairing Anja's interrogation with a seemingly innocuous but carefully staged setting. He ordered that her daily exercise be held at the same time as the guards' meal break, ensuring she had a clear view of their full, hot, and abundant meal being consumed. This technique led to a significant breakthrough. One evening, Anja asked for an extra blanket, a simple domestic request that was her first deviation from purely military discourse. The request was granted, but it signaled a crack in the facade. She was starting to accept the reality of her dependency on the enemy's logistical benevolence. The physical spectacle had prepared the ground, but the final secret was hidden in the tiny wooden bird. It was not sentimental, but technical. Its precise carving, specifically the number of minute notches on its tail and wings, was later identified by a former cryptographer on Campbell's team as a form of micro-encoded cipher. It was a pre-arranged physical encryption key designed to be inconspicuous and virtually undetectable by standard searching methods. The bird was a silent message, an attempt to pass a critical piece of information to a potential werewolf contact disguised as a cleanup crew worker, a contact that Anja had yet to admit even existed. The key to the bird's code had to be somewhere in her memory, and the Canadians now knew their target was not the truth of the past, but the plan for the immediate future. The psychological game of cat and mouse was about to become an urgent race against time. The mystery of the staring had led to a far deeper, more dangerous secret. The tiny wooden bird, the seemingly innocuous carving found hidden in Anja Keller's boot heel, was the key to unlocking the true strategic value of her capture. It was a brilliant, last-ditch attempt by German intelligence to transmit a critical location before the entire signals network went dark. The former cryptographer on Major Campbell's team, a German Jewish refugee named Elias Voss, who had fled Germany in 1938, was the first to recognize the pattern. Voss, working under an assumed name, had an intimate understanding of the esoteric and often Baroque ciphers used by the Abwehr and SS intelligence. He realized the notches on the bird's tail represented a binary sequence, and the subtle variations in the wood grain on the wings corresponded to a transposition matrix. This was an ornithological cipher, designed to look like a simple piece of folk art. Voss's immediate analysis revealed that the cipher was meant to decode a short, urgent message that Anja had been ordered to memorize. A message that designated a final rendezvous point for a werewolf cell operating in the Harz Mountains, a rugged, forested area ideal for a protracted guerrilla war. This cell was reportedly armed with stockpiled Panzerfausts and enough ammunition to harass Allied supply lines for months, posing a significant threat to the occupation's stability. The clock was ticking. The cell's activation signal, a prearranged phrase broadcast over a specific low-power frequency, was due within 72 hours. Campbell needed to break Anja's code of silence to extract the memorized message before the werewolf went dark. The previous psychological pressure, the shock of the Canadian physique, had softened the ground, but it hadn't provided the crucial final piece. Campbell decided on a radical shift in strategy, moving away from the shock of abundance and towards a shock of familiarity. He ordered that Anja be moved from the sterile internment camp environment to a small commandeered house in the nearby town, a house that, critically, was occupied by a German family, carefully vetted and observed. The goal was to remove the visual contrast of the Canadian Guards and replace it with the comfort and, crucially, the unspoken judgment of her own people. The irony was potent. The Allies were using the very cultural environment Anja was fighting to protect as a tool of her undoing. The family, a mother and daughter who had lost their husband-father on the Eastern Front, treated Anja not as a prisoner, but as a misguided younger sister. They spoke of the collapse, the hunger, and the desperation with a quiet resignation. This sudden shift had a profound effect. Anja, used to the strict hierarchy and emotional coldness of the military, was overwhelmed by the sudden exposure to raw domestic pain. One evening, the mother served the only food they had, a small, thin soup. The daughter, about 12, offered Anja her own tiny slice of stale bread. This act of civilian kindness, contrasted with the knowledge that Anja held the key to a resistance movement that would only prolong the civilian suffering, proved to be the final breaking point. Major Campbell, watching from a hidden observation post, noted the moment Anja's eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but of profound moral exhaustion. The werewolf mission, once a heroic act of faith, now seemed like a selfish perpetuation of misery. She asked for Campbell. "I will tell you what I know," she whispered, "but only if you guarantee the safety of this family." The deal was struck, the moral cost of her secrecy having finally outweighed the ideological commitment. The physical shock of the enemy's strength had opened the door, but the emotional shock of her own people's suffering had forced it open. Anja Keller was finally ready to deliver the final communication, the memorized message that the wooden bird was waiting to decode. With Anja Keller's cooperation, Major Campbell's team had the memorized message, "The harvest is ready, K-worm 48. The message was cryptic, but when combined with the binary transposition cipher derived from the wooden bird, Elias Voss was able to triangulate a location. K-worm 48 was not a grid reference, but an internal code name for an abandoned Gestapo training center, disguised as a forestry outpost, located deep in the Harz Mountains. The 48 indicated the hour of the final rendezvous. The activation signal was due to be broadcast in less than 24 hours. This was the climax of the narrative, a race against the very shadows of the collapsing Reich. The challenge was not one of conventional warfare, but of stealth. A massive conventional attack would alert the werewolf cell and allow them to scatter into the heavily wooded mountains, where they could become a long-term devastating irritant. Campbell decided on a surgical, low-profile infiltration, Operation Nightingale. He selected a small hand-picked unit of Canadian Rangers, men chosen not for their bulk, but for their tracking skills, endurance, and fluency in German. Many were first-generation immigrants. The irony continued. The silent, robust men who had inadvertently broken Anja's ideological spirit were now the instruments of its physical destruction. The Rangers were flown in via a single, unmarked transport plane and inserted 15 kilometers from the target. Their mission: neutralize the outpost and capture the werewolf leader, a former SS major known for his fanatical adherence to the scorched earth strategy. The infiltration itself was a masterclass in low-intensity warfare. Moving silently through the dense pine forests, the Rangers used specialized German communications equipment, captured earlier in the war, to impersonate a reconnaissance patrol. They utilized the element of surprise, hitting the outpost just hours before the expected rendezvous. The fighting was brief, brutal, and utterly silent. The Canadian soldiers, masters of close-quarters combat and conditioned by years of high-caloric field life, moved with a speed and efficiency that overwhelmed the malnourished, ideologically zealous, but physically exhausted werewolf personnel. The initial shock of the robust Allied soldiers, a psychological weapon in the internment camps, became a physical reality in the close confines of the bunker. The leader, the SS Major, was captured attempting to destroy a cache of detailed maps showing potential sabotage targets, bridges, rail lines, and power plants across the occupation zone. The entire werewolf plot, a final, desperate attempt to destabilize the peace, was neutralized before it could begin. The strategic success of Operation Nightingale was immediately apparent. It proved that the logistical and psychological victory the Allies had already achieved was the key to eliminating the residual, fanatical resistance. Anja Keller, the signals operator, who couldn't stop staring at the strong men who represented the enemy's abundance, had provided the single, most crucial piece of information. Her small, internal surrender averted a wave of significant chaos and bloodshed. The immediate aftermath brought Anja back to Camp CO30, but her status had irrevocably changed. She was no longer just a POW, she was an intelligence asset, and soon a witness. Her life was now tied to the legacy of the secrets she had held and the profound choice she had made. The final act of the war for her was not an ending, but the start of a long, complex accounting. The story of Anja Keller and the broad-shouldered Canadians is more than a footnote of espionage. It is a profound lesson in the often overlooked mechanics of total war and the psychology of power. The war was won not just by tanks and planes, but by the calories and the consistent protein that fueled the Allied soldiers, creating a visible psychological advantage that demoralized the enemy even in captivity. The sheer physical difference was a product of the titanic industrial output of the North American continent, which remained untouched by war. The Canadian supply line, a logistical marvel, guaranteed that the fighting men were at peak physical condition, a silent walking testament to the failure of the German war economy. The staring of the Helferinnen was not a gaze of simple attraction, but a deep, involuntary acknowledgement of an undeniable material superiority that shattered the core tenets of their nationalist ideology. Anja Keller's journey from a fanatical signals operator to a key intelligence collaborator is a microcosm of Germany's own transition, a necessary surrender of the ideological illusion in the face of insurmountable reality. The small act of kindness, the shared piece of bread from the German girl, combined with the constant grinding pressure of the enemy's robust health, proved that the human need for survival and compassion was ultimately more powerful than the Nazi doctrine of sacrifice and defiance. In the subsequent denazification trials, Anja was given a comparatively lenient sentence, largely due to her cooperation in Operation Nightingale. Her testimony was vital in understanding the final, desperate measures taken by the Wehrmacht. She eventually emigrated, carrying with her the quiet trauma of her experience and the indelible memory of the shock of seeing men whose bodies themselves were a declaration of victory. The legacy of the Canadian Provost Corps and their robust stature remains an underappreciated chapter of psychological warfare. They were ordinary men made extraordinary by a logistics chain unprecedented in history, becoming silent, walking symbols of a material strength the Reich could never match. They represented the strength of democracy's supply line, a strength born not of fascist zeal, but of open industrial capacity. The true meaning of strength, as revealed in Anja Keller's staring, was not the spiritual toughness preached by Goebbels, but the physical and logistical power to feed an entire army while simultaneously feeding a continent. It was the power of abundance defeating the power of scarcity. The story of the broad-shoulder enigma serves as a final critical reminder. The infrastructure of war, the ration tin, the convoy, the logistical efficiency, is a strategic weapon as potent as any bomb. And sometimes, the most effective act of psychological warfare is simply the sight of a well-fed soldier. This has been a deep dive into the human, technological, and strategic currents that defined the end of the Second World War. We have explored the psychological impact of logistics, the use of physical presence as a strategic tool, and the breaking of a fanatical resistance through a subtle game of emotional and material contrast. If you have found the detail and depth of this historical account compelling, we encourage you to subscribe to the channel and share this script with fellow history enthusiasts. Your engagement ensures that we can continue to uncover these complex, untold stories of the great conflicts of history. Thank you for watching.